She arrived with nothing but a name on a contract and a locked trunk, and within 10 minutes of stepping off that stagecoach, the most powerful man in the valley had already decided she needed to be destroyed. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she'd spoken out of turn or made an enemy before she'd even learned the streets, but because Harlan Voss had looked at Elena Hawthorne the way a chess player looks at a piece that doesn't belong on the board, and he'd made a decision right then and there that she wouldn't last the week. He was almost right. Almost. If you've ever been dismissed before you even opened your mouth, if you've ever watched someone decide your worth before they knew your name, then this story belongs to you. Stay with me until the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Millbrook arrived 47 minutes late, which was considered early for Dry Creek. The town sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines that caught the wind wrong and funneled dust down the main street in slow, deliberate spirals, like the land itself was trying to sweep the place clean of people. It was the kind of town that had been almost prosperous twice in its history, once when the silver rumors came through, and once when the railroad scouting party stopped for 3 days before moving their planned route 14 miles north. Both times, Dry Creek had leaned forward like a dog expecting a treat, and both times it had been left with nothing but the memory of possibility. The buildings along Main Street were a mix of ambition and surrender. A proper mercantile with glass windows sat next to a feed store with a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired man's shoulders. The hotel had 2 stories and a sign that had once read Silver Star Inn, but now just said Ilver Tar Inn, because the S and the S had fallen off in the same windstorm 3 years back, and nobody had gotten around to replacing them. The saloon, naturally, was in the best repair of any structure in town. It always was. 12 people were on the main street when the stagecoach rolled in. By the time the driver had set the brake and the dust had settled, there were 30. Word traveled fast in small towns. Word about a mail-order bride traveled faster. Elena Hawthorne stepped down from the coach, with her left hand gripping the doorframe and her right hand holding the hem of her skirt above the mud that had collected at the base of the step. She was 30 years old, though she looked both younger and older depending on the light, younger in the angles of her face, older in the steadiness of her eyes. She was not beautiful in the way that made men stop walking, but she was the kind of woman that made them look twice after they'd already looked away, because there was something in how she held herself that didn't quite match the circumstances. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been respectable once, maybe 2 seasons ago. Her dark hair was pinned up under a hat that had survived the 3-day journey better than most things. She carried a small leather satchel over her shoulder, and she stood at the bottom of the stagecoach steps and looked up and down the main street of Dry Creek with the careful, measuring expression of a woman who had learned to assess a situation before she committed herself to it. Behind her, the driver and his assistant unloaded luggage from the roof of the coach. One piece at a time, bags and cases came down. When they reached Elena's trunk, a large weathered thing reinforced at the corners with iron brackets, it took both men to lower it. That was when Harlan Voss made his entrance. He didn't walk down the street like other men. He moved through it the way a current moves through water, and the people around him adjusted without quite realizing they were doing it. He was 52 years old, broad through the shoulders, and dressed in the manner of a man who wanted you to know he could afford better than you. His suit was black wool in a town where most men wore canvas and denim. His boots were polished. His hat was new. He wore a gold watch chain across his vest that caught the afternoon light and held it. He had 3 men with him, which was also his way. Harlan Voss was never alone in public, not because he was afraid, but because a man with 3 people always beside him didn't need to be. He stopped near the stagecoach, looked at Elena, looked at her trunk, and then said something that he probably hadn't planned, but that came out of him the way certain things come out of certain men, naturally, without effort, almost as a reflex. That's a lot of baggage for someone nobody sent for. He said it loud enough for the street to hear. That was intentional. Elena had been in the process of looking for a face she recognized. The face of Silas Granger, the rancher whose name was on the contract folded in her satchel. She turned toward Voss's voice, not because she was startled, but because it was aimed at her, and she had learned early in life that ignoring something aimed at you was rarely a strategy that worked. She looked at him. She didn't say anything yet. Voss gestured toward the trunk with a lazy wave of his hand. "What's in it? Let me guess." He looked at the men around him, inviting them to enjoy the moment. Hopes and disappointments. A few people laughed. Not everyone, but enough. The ones who laughed weren't laughing because they were cruel people. They laughed because Harlan Voss expected them to, and in Dry Creek, disappointing Harlan Voss had real consequences. The driver's assistant had tied a baggage tag to the trunk's handle during transit. Standard practice, a simple card with the passenger's details for identification. Voss stepped forward, reached down without asking anyone's permission, and flipped the tag over. He read it. Then he straightened up and looked at the crowd with an expression of theatrical amusement. "Worthless cargo," he announced. Elena felt the words before she understood them. There was a physical quality to public humiliation, a heat that started in the face and moved inward, like something being lit from the outside. She stepped toward the trunk. "That's my property," she said. Her voice was even, which cost her something. "It's also a fire hazard," Voss said, still performing for the crowd. "Old wood, worn straps. Whatever's in there, darlin', I hope it's not anything you're planning to use." He looked at the crowd again. "Boys, what do you call cargo that's not worth the freight?" "Worthless cargo," someone called out, a drunk voice from the direction of the saloon porch. But others picked it up, some laughing, some just repeating it because it was easier than standing in silence. Elena put her hand on the trunk's iron handle and straightened. She was aware of every eye on the street. She was aware of the heat in her face. She was aware that the contract in her satchel had brought her here to meet a man she'd never seen, to a town that had already decided what she was, and that whatever she did in the next 30 seconds would be what these people remembered about her for as long as she stayed. She looked at Harlan Voss directly. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but I know what you're doing." Voss smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never been told no by anyone in the valley and had therefore never learned what no looked like coming. "Just making conversation, sweetheart." "You're making an audience," Elena said. "There's a difference." The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for one person who was watching carefully to notice. That person was standing at the far edge of the small crowd, near the post that held up the feed store's narrow awning. He'd been there since before the stagecoach arrived. He'd arrived 10 minutes early, which was unusual for him, because he had 47 other things that needed doing at the ranch, and coming into town to meet a woman he hadn't asked for was not something he'd budgeted time for. Silas Granger was 34 years old and had the look of a man who'd spent most of those years outside in weather that wasn't always cooperative. He was lean in the way that comes from work rather than hunger, though there had been some of both in recent years. His face was angular, weathered, with a jaw that didn't quite set right from an old break that had healed crooked. He had dark eyes that had the habit of going still when he was thinking, which happened often enough that some people mistook it for hostility. He watched Voss work the crowd and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, but sat somewhere between the two. He'd known Harlan Voss for 11 years. He'd watched him buy up 3 neighboring ranches in the last 4 seasons alone. He understood exactly what Voss was doing right now and why. Because a woman who arrived humiliated and dependent was useful to Voss in ways that Silas hadn't quite worked out yet, but would. He pushed himself off the post and walked toward the stagecoach. The crowd parted for Silas the way it parted for most men in work clothes who walked with a particular kind of purpose, not the theatrical purpose of a man like Voss, but the practical purpose of a man who was about to do something specific and didn't need anyone's attention to do it. He stopped next to Elena's trunk. He didn't look at Voss immediately. He looked at Elena. "Elena Hawthorne," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm Silas Granger." She studied him for a moment. Whatever she'd expected, she'd spent 3 days on a coach imagining a face. This wasn't quite it. He was not what the letter had suggested. The letter had been practical, almost formal, describing the ranch, the work, the arrangement. It had not been warm exactly, but it had been honest, or at least she'd thought so. Looking at him now, she thought honest was probably still accurate. Warm was going to take some time. "You're late," she said. Not accusatory, observational. "I know," he said. "Coach came in early." Coach was 47 minutes late. Silas absorbed this. "Then I'm more late than I thought." A few people in the crowd laughed at that, different from the earlier laughter. Nervous laughter. The kind that happens when 2 people meet under public scrutiny and refuse to perform discomfort for the audience. Voss had not left. He stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets, watching this reunion with the interest of a man who'd invested in the outcome. "Granger," he said, "I didn't know you were expecting company." Silas turned to look at him then. "You know what I'm expecting, Harlan." Something passed between the two men, something compressed and old, the kind of tension that accumulates over years and doesn't need much surface area to communicate itself. Voss's smile stayed in place, but his eyes did something different, hardened, recalibrated. "She came a long way," Voss said, "for a ranch that's barely standing." "Ranch is standing fine," Silas said. "For now." Voss said the two words lightly, the way you'd mentioned the weather. Then he turned back to the crowd as if the conversation bored him. "Well, good luck to you both." He looked at Elena. "You're going to need more than luck, sweetheart. You're going to need a miracle." He walked away, his three men falling into step around him, and the crowd began to disperse the way crowds do when the main event has passed. Gradually, in twos and threes, already revising the story into the version they'd tell at dinner. Elena watched Voss go. Then she looked at Silas. "Who is he?" "Harlan Voss," Silas said. "He owns about a third of the valley and wants the other 2/3. "Does he want your ranch?" Silas bent down and took hold of one side of the trunk's leather strap. "Help me with the other side," he said. "Does he want your ranch?" she asked again. Silas looked up at her. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes did that still thing, thinking, calculating. "Yes," he said. She took hold of the other side of the strap. They loaded her trunk into the back of Silas's wagon in silence. His horse, a large, patient bay named Luther, who communicated his feelings mostly through the angle of his ears, stood tied to the post outside the mercantile, indifferent to the recent drama. Silas climbed onto the wagon seat. Elena stood beside the wagon and didn't climb up. He looked down at her. "You coming?" he said. "I want to understand the arrangement first," she said, "before I go anywhere." He had the brief expression of a man who'd expected this to be simpler than it was turning out to be. Then it passed. "All right. The contract says a 6-month trial period," Elena said, "during which time I have full right of refusal and can return to Millbrook with my transportation provided." "That's what it says." "I want to know if that's what you actually intend, or if that was just language your solicitor put in to make it look equitable." Silas looked at her for a moment. "You always talk like this to people you just met?" "I talk like this to people I'm about to make decisions with." He considered that. "The contract says what it says. You want to leave after a week, I'll drive you to the station myself. After a month? Same answer. After 3 months? Are you planning to leave after 3 months?" "I'm planning to know what my options are," she said. Silas took a slow breath. "Miss Hawthorne, I'm not going to pretend this situation is anything other than what it is. I needed help with the ranch. Hiring someone outright costs money I don't have right now. The arrangement—" He paused, seemed to choose words carefully. "The arrangement was presented to me as practical. I'm not going to tell you it was romantic. I'm not going to tell you we're well matched because I don't know you well enough to say that." She was quiet, listening. "What I can tell you is that I don't lie to people and I don't trap them," he continued. "If you come out to Iron Ridge and it's not what you want, you say so and we figure it out. I'm not going to hold a contract over your head like a debt." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she climbed up onto the wagon seat. "All right," she said. "All right? That's what I needed to know." Silas unwrapped the reins from the post and clicked Luther forward. They moved down the main street of Dry Creek past the mercantile and the feed store and the Ilver Tar Inn, and Elena looked at the town as it slid past her and thought, "I have made larger bets on thinner odds than this." She had. That was the part she hadn't told the contract. The road from Dry Creek to Iron Ridge Ranch was 9 miles of terrain that started out merely difficult and then got more interesting. For the first 4 miles, it was a proper wagon track, rutted but manageable. Then the track climbed a low ridge and descended into the valley where Iron Ridge sat, and on that descent the road became something that called itself a road out of habit more than accuracy. Silas handled it automatically, making small adjustments with the reins that looked like nothing from the outside, but were actually continuous negotiation with the horse and the terrain. Elena held on to the wagon seat with one hand and watched the country open up around them. It was not what she'd expected. She'd grown up in cities, or what passed for cities this far west, places with enough population to have a newspaper and two competing churches. She'd read the letters describing Iron Ridge and formed a mental picture that was more or less accurate in its details, but had missed the larger quality of the landscape. The way the ridgelines came down to the valley like arms holding something. The color of the grass in late afternoon, not green exactly, more of a silver green that moved in the wind like something living. The smell of it, dry and sharp, with underneath it the smell of water from somewhere. "How much land?" she asked. 412 acres, Silas said. 300 usable. The rest is ridge and rocky ground. Cattle? 218 head. Should be more, but we lost 30 in the fever that came through in March. What kind of fever? He glanced at her sideways. Bovine respiratory disease. Took out a lot of ranches that season. He paused. Not quick enough in our response. Who's your foreman? Man named Cutter. Dob Cutter. Been with the ranch 12 years. How many hands? 7. 6 after sunset tonight. Archie Beam is leaving at end of week. Found work with better wages. Elena heard the weight in that last sentence. She didn't comment on it directly. Grazing rotation? Silas glanced at her again. Longer this time. We rotate the pastures, he said, with the careful tone of a man who suspects he's about to be corrected. Seasonally? Yes. How many pastures to how many sections? A pause. 2 main pastures. We move between them. Elena said nothing. She looked out at the valley. What? Silas said. I didn't say anything. You made a face. I didn't make a face. You made a face, he said, with the certainty of a man who'd noticed it, even if he couldn't describe it. She turned to look at him. 2 pastures and 218 cattle is a faster path to degraded land than most people plan on. He was quiet. I'm not criticizing, she said. I'm telling you what I know. Where'd you learn about grazing rotation? My uncle ran 400 acres in Kansas for 11 years, she said. I spent 3 of those years helping him run it before he sold out. Not because he wanted to, because the land gave out. 2 pastures worked for us before. 2 pastures worked for you before you had as many cattle, or before the drought 2 seasons back? She watched his expression. Or both. He was quiet for a long time. The wagon descended the last section of the road, and the valley opened up below them. And there, sitting against the far ridge, with the long afternoon shadow falling across its eastern side, was Iron Ridge Ranch. It was not what Elena had imagined, because she had imagined something in worse shape. The main house was solid, timber frame, 2 stories, in need of paint but structurally intact. The barn was large and looked maintained. There were 2 outbuildings she couldn't identify from this distance, and a bunkhouse that showed lamplight in its one visible window. The fences she could see from the road were upright mostly. The cattle in the near pasture were... She stopped. She looked at the cattle in the near pasture. Those animals look thin, she said. Silas said nothing for a moment. We're working on it. How many have you lost since March? 9 more. Not to fever, to... He stopped. Seemed to calculate what to admit. Weakness. Poor grazing. We're having trouble keeping weight on some of them. What does your veterinary man say? We don't have a regular veterinary man. Closest one is 30 miles out, in Callahan. We bring him out when it's critical. And you don't think 9 head lost to weakness is critical? I think, Silas said carefully, that we do what we can with what we've got. He said it without defensiveness, which was what stopped her from pushing further. It was not the statement of a man who didn't care. It was the statement of a man who was aware of every inadequacy and was not under any illusion about them. They rode the last half-mile to the ranch house in silence. Dob Cutter was standing by the barn when the wagon came in, and he had the look of a man who had been standing there for a while and intended to make that fact visible. He was 50 years old and built like something that had been carved and then left out in the weather for 2 decades. His face was creased in ways that suggested a lot of squinting into sun, and his eyes, gray, sharp, containing an opinion about most things, went to Elena immediately and stayed there with an expression that was not hostile exactly, but was not welcoming either. It was the expression of a man who had been with a ranch for 12 years and had watched it change under him and had learned to mistrust change because change had mostly not been kind. He didn't say anything when the wagon stopped, just stood with his arms crossed and looked. Silas climbed down first. "Elena Hawthorne, this is Dob Cutter, foreman." Elena climbed down from the wagon. She didn't wait for help, which Cutter noticed, and extended her hand. "Mr. Cutter?" He shook it briefly. "Miss." Then to Silas, "That back fence by the north corner came down again." "Same post?" "Same post." Silas made a sound that suggested this was an ongoing conversation about a recurring problem. "I'll have a look tomorrow." "Should have had a look last week," Cutter said. He wasn't saying it to be difficult. He was saying it because it was true. "I know," Silas said. He turned back to Elena. "I'll show you the house." Cutter's gaze followed them across the yard. Elena could feel it between her shoulder blades. Not dangerous, just evaluating. The house was, inside, more livable than its exterior suggested. The main room had a large stone fireplace that took up one wall, a heavy table with 6 chairs, and shelves of practical books, ranch management records, almanacs, a medical reference. 2 works of history that had probably been read and reread more than anything else in the room. The kitchen was behind the main room, wood-burning stove, cold pantry, window above the sink that looked out at the barn. Elena stood in the middle of the main room and looked at everything carefully, not evaluating it for comfort, evaluating it for what it told her. "The books are yours?" she asked. "Some were my father's." "How long has the ranch been in your family?" 19 years. My father built the house. I've been running it since I was 22. "Since he passed?" A small pause. "Since he got sick. He lived another 4 years. Watched me run it into the ground, and then watched me pull it back." He said this without self-pity, the way you say something that is simply true. "Then he died. And I thought we were in a better position, and then the drought came." Elena looked at the shelves, then at the fireplace, then at the window. "The position I was told about in the correspondence," she said. "The financial position. How accurate was it?" Silas was quiet for a beat. "Which version of the correspondence?" She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means there were 2 versions," he said. He sat down in one of the chairs at the table, not performing casualness, but genuinely tired in a way that had been going on for some time. "The one that went out to the agency in Millbrook was," he rubbed the back of his neck, "optimistic. Optimistic. The ranch's actual debt position is larger than what was represented." Elena felt something cool move through her. Not quite betrayal. She hadn't known him long enough for betrayal, but the particular coldness of having been given incomplete information for an important decision. "How much larger?" she said. He told her the number. She sat down across from him. "That's not optimistic," she said. "That's a different thing entirely." "I know." "Who wrote the correspondence?" "A man named Garrett Souls. He handles my financial accounts in town." He looked at the table. "He's also Voss's accountant." The silence that followed this had weight to it. "You didn't know that when you hired him," Elena said. "I knew it by the time the letters went out," Silas said. "And I—" He stopped. "I told myself it didn't matter. That the accounting was the accounting and there was no reason for him to misrepresent anything. And now I'm sitting across from a woman who traveled 3 days and made a major decision based on information that wasn't accurate." He met her eyes. "And that's not right. Whatever else is going on, that's not right. If you want to leave in the morning, I'll take you to the station." Elena looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Show me the cattle records." He blinked. "What?" "The cattle records. Weights, losses, dates, feed costs. Show me what you have." "I just told you the ranch is in worse shape than you were led to believe." "I heard you." She looked at him steadily. "Show me the records." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who didn't know exactly what was happening, but suspected it was something he hadn't planned for. He got up and went to the shelves and brought back 3 leather ledgers. They sat at the table for 2 hours. Silas brought out the ledgers and a lamp as the evening came in, and Elena went through the records with a focus that made him simultaneously uncomfortable and oddly reassured. She asked questions, specific, practical questions, and he answered them. And occasionally she made small notations in the margin of her own notebook, which she'd pulled from her satchel. From outside came the sounds of the ranch settling into evening, the low scattered sounds of cattle, the closing of the barn door, boots on the bunkhouse steps. Once, Cutter knocked and opened the front door enough to say, "Horses are in," and then looked at Elena at the table and at the ledgers spread between them and closed the door again without comment. Around 9 o'clock, Elena sat back and rubbed her eyes. "Three problems," she said. Silas, who had been watching her work with the attentiveness of a man who didn't know whether to feel hopeful or defensive, said, "Three. The grazing rotation is the first. You're running the same pastures in the same pattern, and the land isn't recovering fast enough between cycles. That's part of why the cattle are losing weight. What's the second? Your weakest animals aren't receiving supplemental nutrition. I can see it in the weights. Every animal under 400 pounds is in the same decline curve. That's not drought, and it's not disease. That's inadequate supplemental care for the vulnerable stock. And the third?" She looked at him. "The third is Garrett Souls." He was quiet. "I don't know yet what Souls is doing or exactly how Voss is involved," she said, "but the misrepresentation in the correspondence isn't a mistake. Mistakes go both ways. This one went only in the direction that made you look more financially stable and me more likely to come here with fewer preconditions. Why would Voss want you here with fewer preconditions?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but he went out of his way to make a scene when I arrived. Men like that don't do things without reasons." Silas looked at her. She was tired. The 3-day journey was still on her, visible in the set of her shoulders, but her eyes were sharp and clear. He thought about what she'd just done for 2 hours, sat with the ledgers of a failing ranch belonging to a man she'd just met, and worked through them like they were hers. "Why are you still here?" he asked. It came out more honestly than he'd intended. She looked at him. Then she looked at the ledgers. "Because I'm good at this," she said simply. Not proud about it, just factual. And because whoever engineered whatever is happening here was counting on me to not be. She stood and closed her notebook. "I'll need my trunk brought in. And tomorrow morning I want to walk the pastures before the hands are out. I want to see the land when it's quiet." Silas stood. "All right, one more thing," she said. "What?" "That tag Voss read off my trunk today," she said. "The one he said read worthless cargo." "I didn't see what it said." "It said Elena Hawthorne, Millbrook to Dry Creek, Iron Ridge Ranch." She looked at him directly. "Voss made up the rest. He wanted the crowd to hear a particular thing. I want you to know that because sooner or later someone is going to repeat that story, and I want at least one person in this town to know what actually happened." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "I'll get your trunk," he said. The room they gave her was on the second floor, at the east end of the house where she'd catch the morning light. It had a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a washstand with a cracked ceramic basin, and a single window that looked out across the near pasture toward the ridge. She unpacked only what she needed for the night. The trunk stayed mostly closed. There was something in the act of fully unpacking, of spreading yourself across a space, that felt like a commitment she wasn't ready to make. Not because she'd decided to leave, because she'd decided to be careful. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to the ranch. It was different from every silence she'd known. Cities had a continuous background noise that you stopped hearing, but that was always there, a kind of humming static of people. The stagecoach towns she'd passed through had their own sounds: wind, saloon music, the occasional raised voice. Iron Ridge at night was something else. The cattle sounds were distant. The wind moved through the grass outside with a sound like something breathing slowly. The house settled around her with small wooden sounds. She thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about the word he'd said, worthless, and how he'd said it in front of a crowd and how a crowd had laughed, and how she had stood there and felt it land. She'd felt it land. That was the thing she didn't say to Silas and wouldn't have said. The words had landed and hurt, because words like that, delivered publicly by a powerful man in front of a gathered crowd, were designed to land and hurt. That was their function. But she'd been hurt before, by more targeted things than a stranger's cruelty. She'd lost the ranch in Kansas with her uncle. She'd lost her mother in the winter of her 27th year. She'd made a decision at the age of 29, living in a rooming house in Millbrook and writing figures into a ledger for a man who paid her barely enough to eat, that she was finished waiting for circumstances to be favorable before she moved forward. The mail-order arrangement had not been romantic. She'd been clear-eyed about that from the start. It was a practical response to a practical situation, a chance at land, at work that mattered, at a life that had more square footage than a rooming house. She hadn't expected to arrive and find the finances worse than advertised. She hadn't expected the public humiliation. She hadn't expected to sit at a kitchen table for 2 hours going through a stranger's ledgers and feel, for the first time in 3 years, that she was doing what she was supposed to be doing. She thought about the cattle in the near pasture, the thin ones, the ones losing weight on rotation patterns that weren't giving the land time to recover. She knew what to do about that. She didn't know yet what to do about Harlan Voss or Garrett Soules or the shape of whatever had been arranged around her arrival. But she knew what to do about thin cattle in depleted pasture, and that was somewhere to start. She lay down on the narrow bed and pulled the wool blanket over her and listened to the ranch breathe around her. Outside, the near pasture was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky, and the cattle moved in it slowly, patient and undemanding, waiting for whatever came next. She was out before sunrise. The house was still dark, the bunkhouse too. There was one light in the barn. Silas, she found out later, was usually up at 4:30, the habit of years, but she didn't go to the barn. She went to the fence line of the near pasture with the notebook from her satchel and a stub of pencil, and she walked. She walked the full perimeter of the near pasture first, then moved across it in a rough grid, stopping every 20 or 30 paces to crouch and look at the grass. The morning light came up slowly, gray first, and then gold at the ridgeline, and in that gradual light she could see what the pasture was telling her. The grass was right enough at the fence lines, but in the center sections, the heavily trafficked areas where cattle congregated, the ground was compacted. The grass was short and sparse. In 2 places she found sections of bare earth that had started to crust over. She pressed her fingers into the ground and felt the resistance of soil that had been walked on too many times without rest. She wrote notes. She found sections she would designate for recovery. She mapped, roughly, a 3-section rotation that would give each area twice as long to rest. She marked the water sources and noted that the near trough was on the wrong side of the pasture. It was pulling the cattle to one section too consistently, concentrating damage. Then she went to the cattle themselves. The herd was scattered across the upper half of the pasture. She moved through them slowly, not rushing, letting the animals register her presence without treating it as a threat. This was something her uncle had drilled into her. You can't look at cattle properly if they're spooked. You have to be something they can ignore. She moved and they shifted around her, not fleeing but redistributing, and she looked at each animal she passed. The weight, the coat condition, the eyes, the quality of the movement. Most were all right. Not well, not the kind of well they should be, but all right. Eating, moving, maintaining, but there were 15, maybe 17 animals that were noticeably behind the others. Not just thin, something different in how they moved, a flatness to it. She found one, a young heifer, maybe 2 years old, white-patched on her left flank, standing slightly apart from the others with her head low in the particular way that meant something was wrong internally. Elena crouched near her and looked carefully. The heifer's eyes were dull. Her ribs showed more than they should. "Hey," Elena said quietly. Not to communicate anything useful, just to not be silent. The heifer looked at her with the patient, mild expression of a prey animal that had decided she wasn't an immediate threat. Elena made her notes. She was at the far end of the pasture, in the lower section near where the fence ran along the creek bed, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Dob Cutter approaching with 2 mugs. He held one out, coffee. She took it. They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the pasture. "You're up early," Cutter said. Not accusatory, noting a fact. "I wanted to see the land before it got busy," she said. Cutter took a drink of his coffee. "What do you see?" She looked at him. He was asking genuinely. Whatever his reservations about her presence, and she suspected they were significant, he was asking the question because he wanted the answer. "Grazing damage in the center sections," she said. "The rotation isn't giving the land enough recovery time. The trough placement is concentrating your cattle in the wrong areas." She paused. "And you have 17 animals that are not just underweight. Some of them have a secondary issue I want a veterinary man to look at. Particularly that young heifer down by the creek." Cutter turned and looked toward where she was pointing. He was quiet for a long moment. "I've been watching that heifer for 2 weeks," he said. "What does your gut say?" He turned back to his coffee. "My gut says she needs more than pasture rotation." "Does she have a name?" He glanced at her. The question surprised him. "No. We don't name them. It gets complicated when—" He stopped. "When you have to make hard decisions," Elena finished. "Yeah." She looked at the heifer at the far end of the pasture, head still low, standing apart. "I know," she said, "but I'm going to call her something anyway, just between us." Cutter looked at her with an expression that wasn't hostility anymore and wasn't quite warmth, something in between that had the quality of a man revising a first impression under duress. "Suit yourself," he said. "I'm going to call her Margaret," Elena said. Cutter made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "Margaret? She looks like a Margaret." He drank his coffee. "I suppose she does." They stood in the pasture in the early morning light, and the ranch moved around them. The sound of the barn opening, the first voices from the bunkhouse, Luther the horse making his morning noise, and Elena looked at the land and thought about what it needed, and thought about what she needed, and thought that these two things were, perhaps, not as different as she'd expected. Behind them, at the edge of the pasture fence, something lay on the ground that she hadn't noticed in the early light. She walked back toward it and looked down. It was a fence post, one of the interior guideposts that had been pulled clean out of the ground and laid to one side. It hadn't fallen. You could see from the base of it that it had been levered out deliberately. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the fence line and found, 20 feet down, another one. "Mr. Cutter," she said. He walked over, looked down at the post, then at the fence line. "That's not weathering," he said. His voice had changed, gone flat in a different way. "No," she said. "It's not." They looked at each other. "How long has Voss been at this?" she asked. Cutter took a slow breath. "Long enough," he said. "We just haven't been able to prove it." She looked back at the fence posts, then at the pasture, then at the heifer named Margaret standing at the far edge with her head low. "All right," she said. She pulled out her notebook and wrote down the location of the posts, the condition of the ground around them, the date and time. Evidence was evidence. You started collecting it before you knew exactly what you'd need it for. She'd learned that in Kansas, too. The sun was fully up now, burning off the morning gray. Somewhere across the ridge, 9 miles away, Dry Creek was waking up, and in a well-maintained office on the second floor of the only properly painted building on Main Street, Harlan Voss was reading a letter, and the expression on his face as he read was not the theatrical cruelty he'd performed for the crowd, but something quieter and more deliberate, something that looked very much like a plan proceeding on schedule. He had expected the woman to be confused, dependent, grateful for whatever small dignities she was shown. He had not expected her to be in the pasture at 5:30 in the morning with a notebook. He would need to move faster than he'd planned. The fence posts were the beginning, not the beginning of Voss's campaign. That had started long before Elena Hawthorne stepped off a stagecoach in Dry Creek, but the beginning of her understanding of it. She photographed the damage in the only way available to her. She drew it, precisely, in her notebook, annotating measurements and angles with the same care she'd used on the pasture assessment. 2 posts pulled clean, a third loosened but not removed, all within the section of fence line that bordered the creek where cattle were most likely to wander through in the night. She didn't tell Silas immediately, not because she intended to keep it from him, but because she wanted to understand the full picture before she handed him a partial one. Partial pictures led to partial responses, and partial responses to a man like Voss were worse than no response at all. Cutter was watching her when she straightened up from her last notation. "You're not going to tell him," he said. It wasn't accusatory. He was reading her. "I'm going to tell him," she said, "when I have more than 2 fence posts." Cutter thought about that. Then he nodded, once, with the economy of a man who didn't waste movement. "There'll be more." "I know." He picked up his coffee mug from the fence post where he'd set it and turned back toward the barn. After 3 steps, he stopped. "The heifer you named, Margaret." He didn't turn around. "I've been putting out extra feed for her for 10 days. It's not taking." Elena looked toward the far end of the pasture. The heifer was still in the same position. "I'll look at her more carefully this morning." "What do you know about sick cattle?" "Enough," she said. "My uncle lost 2 seasons of calves to respiratory infection before we figured out the pattern. After that, I learned to look for things before they became patterns." Cutter turned around at that. He looked at her with the gray, sharp eyes that didn't give much away, but were always collecting. "Most women who come to ranches out here know how to cook and sew." I can cook, Elena said. I can also sew, but that's not what you need most right now. He made the sound again, the one that might have been the beginning of a laugh. He walked to the barn without finishing it. The morning went hard and fast, the way mornings on working ranches always did. They didn't ease you into the day, they dropped you into it. By 6 o'clock, all 7 hands were moving, and Elena moved with them, not directing, but watching, placing herself where she could see the work without being in the way of it. She'd learned this from her uncle, too. You didn't earn the right to change a system by announcing you were changing it. You earned it by knowing the system better than anyone else in the room. The hands noticed her. Most of them said nothing directly. A young man named Poke, who couldn't have been more than 19 and had the open face of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking, watched her from the corner of the barn for a full 10 minutes before his curiosity outweighed his caution. You know about cattle, he said. Some, she said. Cutter says you were looking at the pasture this morning, before anyone was up. I was. Poke seemed to consider whether he had permission for his next question. What did you think? She looked at him. He was asking earnestly, not testing her, not trying to catch her in something, actually curious. I think the land is tired, she said, and I think we can fix it. Cutter's been trying to fix it for 2 years, he said. Then he heard how that sounded, and his face went slightly red. I didn't mean, you meant that things have been hard for a while, she said. That's not a criticism, that's a fact. He relaxed fractionally. It's been hard, he confirmed. She looked out at the pasture. What do you notice about where the cattle spend most of their time? He turned and looked. She watched him look, watched the small adjustments in his expression as he actually thought about the question. The middle section, he said slowly, near the far trough. Why there? Because, he paused. Because that's where the water is. And where the water is, what happens to the grass? She watched the connection form. His eyes moved from the trough to the compacted section of ground around it. It gets walked down. And when the grass gets walked down in one section, the cattle have less to eat even though they keep going back. He said it like he was hearing it for the first time, which he probably was. That's why they're losing weight. Part of why, she said, we'll move the trough and rotate differently. It'll take time, but it'll work. Poke looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of someone recalibrating. Did Cutter say you could move the trough? Not yet, she said. I'm going to ask him. She asked Cutter at 8 o'clock when he came back from checking the north fence line. She put it as a question, not a directive, and she explained the reasoning clearly without making it sound like a lecture. Cutter listened, standing with his arms crossed, his coffee mug dangling from 2 fingers. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That trough's been in that spot for 6 years, he said. I know. Moving it means new post anchors and extending the water line. I know that too. He looked at her. You know how to lay water line. I know how to help lay water line, she said carefully. I'm better with the cattle assessment side. Another pause. I'll think about it. She nodded and let it go. That was the other thing her uncle had taught her. You plant the idea and you let it work. You don't stand over it. By the time the hands broke for midday food, 2 of them had spoken to her voluntarily. By evening, 4. The ones who hadn't weren't hostile, they were waiting. She understood that. She was waiting too, in a different way. Silas she saw mostly at meals, which were brief and functional. He was not the kind of man who sat at table after the food was finished. There was always something else that needed doing, and the ranch had its own kind of gravity that kept pulling him back out into it. She noticed that he moved through his own property with a specific quality of awareness. He was always observing, always tracking, his eyes going to fence lines and cattle positions, and the quality of the light on the ridge even in the middle of conversations about other things. On the 3rd evening, she found him in the barn after supper, examining Luther's near foreleg with the focused expression of a man who had noticed something and wasn't sure yet what it was. What is it? She asked. Soft tissue swelling, he said, without looking up. Not hot, just off. She crouched beside him and ran her fingers along the same area he was examining. Luther shifted slightly and then settled. The swelling was subtle. You'd have to know the leg well to notice it. When did you first see it? Yesterday, maybe the day before. Is he favoring it? Slightly. In the morning. She sat back. Rest and monitoring, probably. Unless it worsens. She paused. You notice everything with him. Silas straightened and patted Luther's neck. He's gotten me out of bad situations twice. Least I can do is pay attention. She stood. In the yellow lamplight of the barn, the two of them stood on opposite sides of a large patient horse, and the barn smelled of hay and leather and the particular warm animal smell that Elena had grown up with in Kansas and had missed in the years since more than she'd admitted to herself. I found 2 fence posts pulled out by the creek, she said. Silas went very still. And a third that was worked loose but not pulled, she said, all in the same section. The section where cattle would be most likely to drift through at night. He was quiet for a long moment. Not shocked, more like a man who'd been expecting a particular piece of news and was now recalibrating the timeline. When? First morning, she said. I've been watching that section. There's been nothing since, but I think that's because whoever did it knows we found it. Who else knows? Cutter. Silas nodded slowly. His jaw tightened in a way that was becoming familiar to her, the physical tell of a man keeping something controlled that wanted to be less controlled. This has happened before? She asked. Twice in 6 months, he said. Once on the East Line, once near the road. I couldn't prove anything either time. Did you try? He looked at her. What do you mean, did I try? Did you document it? Write down what you found, where, when? Describe the condition of the posts? I told Cutter. Cutter told the hands, we fixed the fence. She pulled out her notebook and opened it to the page where she'd sketched the fence damage. She turned it toward him. He took it and looked at the precise drawings, the annotations, the measurements. He was quiet for a moment in a different way than before. You drew this? He said. Evidence you can't describe exactly isn't much use later, she said. He looked at the drawings for another moment. Then he handed the notebook back carefully, like it was something that mattered. I should have done this. You were fixing the fence, she said. Not a defense of him exactly, more an acknowledgement that there was always too much to do and some things fell through. I should have done both, he said. He turned back to Luther and checked the swelling one more time, and she could see him organizing things in his mind, the fence post, the documentation, the pattern of small aggressions that he'd been experiencing as isolated problems and was perhaps now beginning to see as a coordinated campaign. Garrett Souls, she said, how much access does he have to your financial accounts? He manages them, Silas said. Bills, payments, records. Does he know when your major debt payments are due? Yes. Does he know when you're most stretched? A pause. Yes. Then he knows when you're most vulnerable to losing a business partner or a supply line, she said, because someone who knows your finances knows exactly when to apply pressure. Silas turned from the horse. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something stripped of the usual composed practicality, something that looked, briefly, like a man who'd just understood the size of what was behind him. I hired him 4 years ago, he said. I know. He had good references. Voss is good at providing references, she said. He rubbed the back of his neck. I have a cattle auction in 6 weeks, 15 head. If I can make that auction count, it covers the next 2 debt payments and buys me time through winter. And Souls knows that. Yes. She looked at him steadily. Then we have 6 weeks to make sure that auction happens the way it needs to. He looked back at her. The barn lamp moved in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows shifted around them. You keep saying we. I noticed, she said. You've been here 3 days. 4, she said, and I haven't left yet. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be something other than simple. Then he looked back at the horse, and when he spoke again his voice had a different quality. Quieter, more careful. The money I owe, he said. It's more than I told you at the table the other night. She looked at him. How much more? He told her. She absorbed it. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at Luther, who was regarding them both with the patient disengagement of an animal who'd heard a lot of human conversations and had reached no conclusions about them. Is there any part of this you're not telling me? She asked. He thought about it honestly. That was the thing about him that she'd begun to identify. He actually thought about questions before he answered them, instead of giving the first comfortable answer. Probably, he said. Not because I'm trying to hide it, because I'm still working out what all of it means myself. Then we'll keep working it out, she said. She picked up the lamp from the hook near the barn door. Get some sleep, and tomorrow I need you to help me move that trough in the near pasture. Cutter said he'd think about it. Cutter already decided yes, she said. He just needs a day to decide that it was his idea. She heard something from the direction of the barn door as she left. A short, involuntary sound from Silas that was definitely the beginning of a laugh, though she was already outside and into the dark before she could be certain. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. That was the word people used later, when they had the comfort of distance and outcome. At the time, it felt nothing like transformation. It felt like work, most of it grinding and unglamorous, with setbacks scheduled in at irregular intervals to prevent any feeling of momentum from getting too comfortable. The trough move took 3 days, longer than Elena had estimated because the waterline ran through rockier subsoil than anyone had expected, and on the second day a section of it cracked and had to be relayed from scratch. Poke split his palm on a piece of jagged pipe fitting and had to wrap it and keep working, which he did without complaining, which raised him slightly in everyone's estimation, including his own. By the end of it, the trough was in its new position. The near pasture was divided into 3 rotating sections, and Cutter had spent half a day walking the new layout before he said anything. What he said was, "That might work." From Cutter, at that stage, it was practically a declaration of faith. Elena spent her evenings on the weakest animals. The 17 she'd flagged in the first morning walk became 22 as she looked more carefully. 5 more she'd initially given the benefit of the doubt and then stopped giving after watching them for a week. Margaret the heifer was the most worrying. She wasn't declining fast, but she wasn't improving either, and Elena had started supplementing her feed with a mixture of ground oats and dried molasses that her uncle had used for animals that needed caloric encouragement without digestive stress. She sent a letter to the veterinary man in Callahan on the 8th day. She wrote it herself, describing what she'd observed with clinical precision: weights, temperature variations she'd tracked, the dull eyes, the movement quality, the response to supplemental feeding. She asked specific questions. When his response came back 12 days later, slower than she'd hoped, faster than she'd feared, it confirmed 2 things she'd suspected and told her 1 thing she hadn't known. He named a treatment for Margaret specifically and told her what she needed and where to get it. The problem was that where to get it was Harding's supply on Main Street in Dry Creek. She asked Silas about it at breakfast. "Harding's," he said, in a tone that told her before he said anything else. "What?" "Harding's supply has been Voss's since February," he said. "He bought out old Walt Harding when Walt's wife got sick and they needed money fast. Voss gave him fair price, and everyone thought that was decent of him until..." He stopped. "Until you realized what he was buying along with the supply store," she said. "He's got 3 supply businesses in the valley now. If you're a rancher and you need anything beyond what you can grow or make yourself, you go through Voss." Elena sat with that for a moment. Her coffee went from hot to merely warm while she thought. "Is there anyone in Callahan?" "Callahan's 30 miles, adds cost. There's a treatment for that heifer that she needs within the next 2 weeks or we're going to lose her," Elena said. "And if there's an infection developing in the herd at the level I think there might be, we need the supplies to address it before it spreads." She looked at Silas. "Can we go around Voss on this?" "I can try the co-op in Millvane," he said. "It's run by the Hennessy brothers. They don't love Voss either, but they're small. If Voss leans on them, try them first," she said, "and try Callahan as a backup. We need to know our options before we need them urgently." He nodded. Then he looked at his coffee cup. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. "I know. You're already running the supply chain." "Someone has to," she said. "You're running the ranch." He looked up at her. "I'm supposed to be running both." "You can't do everything," she said, not unkindly, "and this is what I'm good at." He was quiet. There was something in his expression she was learning to read. The look he got when he was accepting something that went against how he'd imagined things should work. He had a specific notion of what it meant to be responsible for his own land and his own problems, and that notion involved doing it himself. Accepting help, particularly from a woman who'd been in his house for 2 weeks, didn't come easily or without some kind of internal negotiation. "I appreciate it," he said finally. "I want to say that clearly. What you've been doing, I appreciate it." She looked at him. The words had cost him something to say, and they were real words, not social currency. I know you do, she said. That was the week Voss made his next move, though they didn't know it was his immediately. One of the hands, a quiet, reliable man named Thomas, who'd been at Iron Ridge for 3 years, came to Silas on a Wednesday evening with an expression that said he hadn't wanted to have this conversation and had spent some time trying to find a way out of it. I got an offer, Thomas said. Silas looked at him. From who? Garrison Creek Ranch. A pause that communicated more than the words. Garrison Creek was Voss's southernmost property. Better wages, steady hours. They said they could use someone who knows this valley well. Someone who knows this valley, Silas repeated. Flat. Tomas looked uncomfortable. I got a family in Milvain. The wages here, you know I'm not complaining. You know I understand the situation. But how much better? Silas asked. Tomas told him. Silas absorbed it. Elena, who was across the yard near the barn door and could hear the conversation clearly, kept her attention on the fence plank she was examining. She didn't look over. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Silas said. You got a family. You have to do what's right for them. I wanted to tell you face to face, Tomas said. Not just leave. When? End of next week. A pause. All right, Silas said. Tomas walked away, and Elena waited until he was out of earshot before she crossed the yard to where Silas was standing with his hands in his pockets looking at the middle distance. He's the second one, she said. I know, Silas said. Archie Beam was the first. Now Tomas. Both went to Voss Properties? Beam to Callahan. I don't know if that's Voss. He looked at her. Tomas is. He's going to pick them off one by one, she said. Offer better wages until you don't have enough hands to run the operation effectively. Then when you miss a debt payment, he moves on the note, Silas finished. I know what he's doing. He exhaled slowly. I just can't outbid him. I don't have the money. Elena looked at the bunkhouse, then at the barn, then at the near pasture where the new trough was in place and the cattle were, for the first time in weeks, distributed more evenly across the available grazing. What are the hands who are staying worth to you? She asked. Everything right now, he said. Then we need to give them something that wages don't, she said. Something Voss can't match with money. Silas looked at her. What does Voss not have that I do? She thought about it. She thought about Poke, who'd kept working with a split palm without being asked. She thought about Cutter, who'd walked the new pasture layout for half a day before admitting it might work. She thought about the way the hands talked about the ranch at meals, not with the language of men who were merely employed, but with the specific vocabulary of people who were invested. They know this land, she said. They chose to be here. Voss hires people because he can pay them. You have people who stayed when you couldn't. She paused. Tell them the truth. What truth? All of it, she said. Where the ranch is financially, what's being done to it and why. What the next 6 weeks look like, and what it'll mean if the auction goes the way it needs to. He looked skeptical. Most bosses don't share financial trouble with their hands. Most bosses don't have hands who've stayed through this much trouble, she said. They already know something's wrong. They're not idiots. Telling them the truth respects that. She held his gaze. And it gives them a reason to stay that isn't just money. He was quiet for a long time. The light was going out of the sky in the west, that particular orange going to copper color that happened in this valley when the day ended well. That's a gamble, he said. Yes, she said. So is everything else we're doing. He called the hands together the following morning before the day started. All 5 of the remaining ones, plus Cutter. He told them the truth. He was not smooth about it. He stumbled in places, and the numbers clearly hurt him to say out loud. And once he stopped and started again from a different angle because the first angle was too close to something. But he told them. When he was done, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Cutter said, So the auction in 6 weeks? Yes, Silas said. 15 head. If we get them there in condition... Cutter looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Something passed between them, not agreement exactly, more an acknowledgement that they'd been working toward the same thing from different directions. Margaret's responding to treatment, she said. Not as fast as I'd like, but she's responding. Cutter looked at the other hands, then back at Silas. All right, he said, what do you need? And there was something in those 4 words from Dob Cutter that shifted the air in the yard. Something that wasn't dramatic, wasn't a speech, wasn't the language of resolve and courage that stories usually reached for. It was just a man who'd been with a piece of land for 12 years, deciding he was still with it. The others heard it and said their own versions. Polk's version was enthusiastic. The quieter ones just nodded. That afternoon, a rider came from town with a letter for Elena. She read it in the kitchen. It was from the agency in Millbrook, the same agency that had arranged the marriage contract. It was addressed to her, not to Silas, and it was written in the formal language that people used when they wanted to seem official and impersonal. It said the contract contained a provision she had not been shown. It said that in the event of a financial default on Iron Ridge Ranch during the contract period, all assets brought into the marriage arrangement, including her documented contributions to ranch operations, were legally considered part of the estate and subject to debt settlement. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. Then it took her another moment to understand what it meant. Whatever she built here, whatever work she did, whatever she salvaged, if the ranch went under during the contract period, her contributions weren't hers. They belonged to the debt. They would belong to whoever held the debt. She read it 3 times. Then she set it on the table and sat very still and thought about who had arranged this contract and who had prepared its language and who stood to benefit if she worked hard to save a ranch that then defaulted anyway. She thought about Garrett Soules managing Silas's accounts. She thought about Voss reading her baggage tag at the stage stop and performing her humiliation for a crowd. She thought about the fence posts pulled from the ground near the creek. She thought about Tomas receiving a job offer from Garrison Creek Ranch. It was not 3 separate things. It had never been 3 separate things. She picked up her notebook and opened it to a fresh page and began to write. She wrote fast because the shape of it was clear now and she wanted to get it down before the edges blurred. She wrote what she understood and what she still didn't and what she needed to find out. She wrote names. She drew lines between them. When Silas came in for the evening meal, she was still at the table, the notebook in front of her, 2 pages filled. He looked at the letter sitting beside the notebook. He looked at her face. He sat down. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He sat across from her and listened, and his expression did several things in quick succession: confusion, then comprehension, then something harder and more settled that sat in his jaw and around his eyes, and was the particular look of a man who has just understood that someone has been playing a long game with his life. "The contract," he said, "the same contract the agency sent you." "The provision wasn't in the copy I was given," she said, "but it appears to be in the original." "Soules prepared the financial side of that arrangement," Silas said. "I know." "On my behalf." He said it with a kind of careful precision, like testing ice. "He prepared documents on my behalf that I didn't fully read because I trusted him, and I was dealing with 3 other things that week, and—" He stopped. "It's not your fault," she said. "I trusted him," he said again. "Not an excuse, an accounting." "Voss chose him carefully," she said. "People like Voss always do." The lamp between them was the only light in the kitchen. Outside, the ranch was quiet in the particular way it got after 9 o'clock. Not silent, but settled. Somewhere in the barn, Luther shifted his weight. In the near pasture, the cattle were still. Margaret was still eating tonight. Elena had checked at 8. The heifer's head had been up, which was better than it had been. "What do we do?" Silas said. Elena looked at what she'd written. "We do what we were already doing," she said. "We get those 15 head in condition. We make the auction. We cover the debt payments." She paused. "And we find a way to expose what Soules did and what Voss has been engineering before Voss finds a way to make it look like something else." 6 weeks, Silas said. 6 weeks, she confirmed. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight made the angles of his face sharper, showed the tiredness around his eyes that was a permanent feature now, had been for some time. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight, and only noticed it now because someone was pointing it out. "You could leave," he said. "If you left now, before any of this, before the default clause means anything, you'd be clear of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know." He waited. "I'm not leaving," she said. He held her gaze. "Why not?" She thought about it honestly because he'd asked honestly. "Because whoever put this together was counting on me to be the kind of person who would," she said, "and I'm not going to give them that." She closed her notebook. Outside in the near pasture, the cattle moved quietly through the dark, and the new trough stood exactly where she'd said it should, and the grass in the resting sections was, almost imperceptibly, beginning to come back. The 5 days before the auction were the worst. Not the worst in the way that dramatic things are worst, sudden and loud and over quickly. This was the grinding kind of worst, the kind that accumulated in small increments and didn't give you a clean moment to respond to because there was no single thing to respond to. There was just pressure, applied from multiple directions simultaneously, designed to make you feel like every choice you made was the wrong one. It started with the supply line. Elena had arranged with the Hennessy brothers in Milvain for the remaining treatment supplies Margaret needed and additional feed supplements for the weaker animals in the herd. The arrangement had taken 2 weeks of careful correspondence and a personal visit she'd made with Silas on a Tuesday, 40 miles round trip, because some things couldn't be settled in letters. The Hennessy brothers, Tom and Carl, both in their 50s, both with the cautious faces of men who'd survived in business by being careful, had agreed. They weren't doing it out of charity. They'd had their own history with Voss, a boundary dispute 4 years back that had been settled legally but not emotionally, and they took a quiet satisfaction in being useful to someone Voss wanted to break. The supplies were supposed to arrive Thursday. Thursday came and went. Elena sent a message to Milvain Friday morning. The reply came back Saturday afternoon. Tom Hennessy's message was short and had the clipped quality of a man who was angry and trying to write around it. He said the wagon carrying the supplies had been stopped on the road between Milvain and Dry Creek by 2 men who identified themselves as Voss's land agents. The men had presented a document. Tom called it a document with the bitter emphasis of someone who didn't believe in the document's legitimacy, claiming a right-of-way dispute on the road section. The wagon had been held for 6 hours and then turned back. The supplies were still in Milvain. Elena read the message twice. Then she walked to the barn where Silas was working on the wagon axle and read it to him. He sat back on his heels and looked at the dirt floor of the barn for a long moment. Right-of-way dispute, he said. On the county road. There's no legitimate right-of-way dispute on the county road, she said. He's using paper to do what he can't do directly. We can challenge it. In 30 miles in 5 days, she said. By the time we could challenge it legally, the auction is over. He stood up. He had oil on his hands from the axle work, and he wiped them on a rag with the slow, deliberate motion of a man keeping himself controlled. Can the Hennessys bring the supplies around? South route through Garrison Valley? That adds 12 miles and crosses Garrison Creek Ranch's western boundary. He looked at her. Which Voss owns? Which Voss owns? She confirmed. The barn was quiet for a moment. Outside, Polk was moving cattle from the near pasture to the middle section. The third rotation, right on schedule. And Elena had checked the resting section that morning, and the grass coming back was real and genuine, and would have made her feel better if she weren't standing in a barn trying to figure out how to get medicine to a sick heifer with 5 days until an auction that everything depended on. I'll go myself, she said. Silas looked at her. To Milvain. I'll take whatever horse cutter recommends and go around the county road entirely, cross country where I have to. I can be there and back in 2 days if I start at first light tomorrow. That's rough terrain between here and Milvain going cross-country. I know. And if Voss has people watching, then I move fast and I don't take the obvious routes. She met his eyes. Someone has to go, and it can't be you. You need to be here managing the herd and the hands and making sure everything is ready for Monday. He held her gaze. He was working through it, the risk calculation, the alternative options, the uncomfortable reality that the alternatives were thinner than he wanted them to be. She watched him arrive at the same place she already was. Take Cutter's Gray, he said. She's the most sure-footed horse on the property. I know, Elena said. I already asked Cutter. Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, not quite exasperation. You already asked Cutter before you told me. I wanted to know it was possible before I proposed it, she said. There's no point proposing something that can't work. He shook his head slowly, the way he did when she'd outmaneuvered him logistically, and he'd noticed and was deciding whether to be irritated about it. He usually decided no. Be careful, he said. Then, as if the words had surprised him by coming out, I mean it. She looked at him for a beat. I know you do. She left at 4:30 the following morning before the sky had done anything useful with light. Cutter's Gray, whose name was apparently None, because Cutter had named her None of Your Business during a period of irritation, and the name had stuck through abbreviation, was exactly what he'd promised: sure-footed, responsive, with the particular intelligence of a horse that had covered rough terrain enough to have opinions about the best way through it. Elena had spent the evening prior with a map and 2 lanterns, tracing a route that stayed off the county road entirely and crossed private land only in sections where she'd established, through careful inquiry, that the landowners were not Voss's. She had letters in her saddlebag from Silas, vouching for her purpose in case anyone stopped her. She had Tom Hennessy's address written on 2 separate pieces of paper in 2 separate pockets, because she'd learned years ago that information you're relying on should never exist in only one place. The ride was not as bad as it could have been and not as good as she'd hoped, which was more or less the theme of the last 6 weeks. The cross-country section between Iron Ridge and the Millvane Road was rocky in places that the map had not fully communicated, and twice she had to dismount and lead None through narrow passages between boulders that the horse considered, with reasonable grounds, too uncertain to navigate at speed. She arrived in Millvane at 2 in the afternoon with a fine layer of dust on everything and a soreness in her lower back that she filed away to deal with later. Tom Hennessy opened his door before she'd finished knocking. He was expecting her, or someone. The message she'd sent ahead had arrived, or if it hadn't, he was a man who'd been waiting for something to happen and was ready for whatever version showed up. "You made good time," he said, looking her over with the rapid assessment of someone checking for damage. "Good horse," she said. He brought her inside. Carl was already at the table with the supplies laid out in 2 cases. Organized, labeled, clearly packed for transport. They were ready. They'd been ready, Elena realized, since the wagon turned back. They'd been waiting for someone to come get them. "I need to understand something," she said, after she'd had water and a few minutes to stop moving. "The document they showed your driver, the right-of-way claim." Tom and Carl looked at each other. "Garrett Soules drew it up," Tom said. "We know the man's signature." She sat with that. "You're sure?" "Carl was a land clerk for 8 years before he came to run the business with me," Tom said. "He knows legal documents. He knows what's legitimate and what's been put together to look legitimate." He looked at his brother. Carl reached into a drawer and produced a folded paper. "I made a copy," he said. "Before your driver gave the original back. Seemed like the kind of thing you'd want to have." Elena took the paper and unfolded it. She read it carefully, and what she was reading was not the right-of-way claim itself, but the structure of the document, the formatting, the signatures, the particular language that legal documents use, and the ways this one slightly misused it. She looked at Carl. "This wouldn't hold up to examination." "No," Carl said, "but it held up long enough to turn a wagon around." She folded the copy and put it in her saddlebag with the careful attention she gave to everything that went into that saddlebag. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "All right," Tom said. "The auction Monday. If Silas brings 15 head in good condition, and they are in good condition, I've been working with them for 6 weeks, they're in the best shape they've been in 2 years. Will you buy?" The brothers looked at each other. The look had a conversation in it that didn't need words. "Voss has been to see us," Carl said. 2 weeks ago. I assumed. "Vi told us the Iron Ridge herd was diseased," Tom said. "Said there'd been a fever outbreak that Granger was covering up to make the sale." "There's been no outbreak," Elena said. "There was a respiratory illness in March, 4 months before I arrived. We lost 30 head then. What's left is the viable herd, and the ones I've been treating have a separate nutritional issue that's been addressed." She met Tom's eyes. "I will let you examine every animal before you bid. Any one of them. All of them if you want." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Voss will be at the auction." "I know. He'll try to control the bidding." "He's been trying to control everything for 4 months," she said. "He hasn't managed it yet." Something shifted in Tom Hennessy's face. It wasn't dramatic, just the small movement of a man deciding to be less careful than he usually allowed himself to be. "We'll be there," he said, "and we'll have our own eyes." She rode back to Iron Ridge through the second day with the supply cases strapped to Nunn's saddle and arrived in the yard at sunset on Sunday, 1 day before the auction, to find the ranch in a state of controlled disorder that told her immediately something had happened while she was gone. Silas was in the far pasture. Cutter met her in the yard with the expression of a man who'd had a difficult 48 hours and was about to describe them. Fence on the north section came down last night, he said. East line too, both at once. She looked at him. At once. Within an hour of each other, best we can tell. Started around 2 in the morning. His jaw was tight. Cattle scattered across the creek section and up into the ridge trail. We've been pulling them back since 5 this morning. How many lost? None. But we've got 3 with injuries from the terrain, 1 with a leg cut that needed wrapping, 2 more with minor abrasions. They're okay, but they're stressed, he paused. And the calves got separated. Took us half the morning to get them back to their mothers. She handed him Nun's reins and was moving toward the pasture before he finished the sentence. Where's Silas? North section. He's been out there since before dawn. She found him at the collapsed fence line, kneeling in the mud beside a section of posts that had been cut. Not pulled, not weathered out, cut. At the base, below ground level, with something designed to make it look like rot from the outside. You'd have to pull the post entirely and examine the cut end to know what you were looking at. He looked up when he heard her coming. He was dirty and tired in the particular way that came from physical labor undertaken without sleep, and there was a cut on his left hand that had been wrapped with a piece of cloth that had probably started white. You made it back, he said. I made it back, she said. I have the supplies. She looked at the fence post, at the cut, at his face. How many? 4 sections of fence, coordinated. Someone knew this layout, knew which sections would scatter the cattle the widest if they came down simultaneously. He looked at the post. This wasn't random. This was someone who's been watching us. She crouched beside him and looked at the cut. Clean, deliberate, done with something purpose-made for it. Did anyone see anything? Poke thought he heard horses around too, Silas said. He got up and looked out the bunkhouse window and didn't see anything. By then, they were already gone. She stood. She looked across the north section. The cattle that had been recovered were still unsettled, moving in tight groups with the anxious energy of animals that had been frightened and hadn't fully let go of it. 2 of the younger calves were staying close to their mothers, in the specific way that meant they'd had a bad experience and weren't ready to trust open space again. Can we make the auction? She asked. Silas stood beside her. He looked at the herd with the assessing eyes he always used, the ones that went still when they were taking inventory. 15 head in acceptable condition, he said. Not ideal. They're stressed. Their weights will be down from stress alone, but they're not injured and they're not sick, he paused. If we can get them there. We get them there, she said. Elena. He turned to look at her. Last night, while they were cutting fences, someone went through the house. She turned to him sharply. Nothing taken, he said quickly, or nothing obvious, but things were moved. The desk in the main room, the ledger shelf. His expression was careful. Your notebook. She felt something cold move through her. My notebook. It was on the table where you left it. It's still there, but it's been moved, opened. He held her gaze. Someone went through it. She thought about what was in that notebook. The fence damage documentation, the pasture assessments, the notes she'd made about the contract provision, the lines she'd drawn between Voss and Souls and the pattern of pressure, the copy of the supply wagon document from Carl Hennessy. She thought about why someone would go through it. Not to steal it. If they'd wanted it gone, it would be gone. They'd looked at it, they'd read it. They'd wanted to know what she knew and how much she'd documented. They know what I have, she said. Yes. Which means they know the documentation is good enough to be a problem. Yes. She looked at him. Then we can't wait for a better moment, she said. Whatever I was planning to do with that evidence, we have to do it at the auction. Tomorrow. In front of everyone. He looked at her for a long moment. The evening was coming in around them, the light going copper on the ridge. The settled sounds of the recovered cattle beginning to replace the earlier anxious noise. His hand with the cut wrapped in cloth. His eyes with the tiredness behind them that had been there since before she arrived and was deeper now. That's a risk, he said. Everything we've done is a risk, she said. But they've been running this play from the beginning on the assumption that we'd have nowhere to make it public. That by the time we understood what was happening, we'd be too far down to surface it anywhere that mattered. She looked at him steadily. The auction is the biggest gathering in this valley in 6 months. every rancher, every buyer, half the business people in Dry Creek. If we're ever going to have an audience for the truth, it's tomorrow. He said nothing for a moment. She could see him weighing it, the risk of silence against the risk of exposure, the chance that it worked against the chance that it didn't, all of it balanced against the knowledge that doing nothing was also a choice with consequences. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to get those 15 head to the auction grounds by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," she said. "And I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." He held her gaze. Something passed across his face that was neither easy nor simple, but it settled. "All right," he said. The night before the auction, nobody slept well, or at least nobody admitted to it. Elena sat at the kitchen table until past midnight with her notebook and the copy of the false supply document and everything she'd accumulated over 6 weeks, organizing it into an order that could be communicated clearly and quickly to people who didn't know the background. You couldn't stand up in front of a crowd and tell a complicated story. You had to have the simple version, the one that landed in 30 seconds, and then the evidence to back it up if anyone asked. At one point, Cutter appeared in the kitchen doorway in the manner of a man who'd been awake anyway and thought he might as well acknowledge it. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. That it was still warm meant Elena had made it recently, and sat down across from her. He looked at what she was doing. She didn't explain it. After a moment, he pulled the notebook toward himself and looked at the documentation page. The original fence damage sketch, with dates and measurements. "This is good," he said. "I know." He slid it back. "You've been building this since your first morning here. Since I found the first fence posts." He was quiet. He drank his coffee. Outside, the ranch was dark and still. "Voss has been after this land for 3 years," he said. "Before you came, before the contract. Silas turned down 2 buyout offers." He looked at his coffee cup. "Third approach was this." He gestured at the table, the notebook, the accumulated evidence of a months-long campaign. Fancier, more complicated. "Because the direct offers didn't work," Elena said. "So he found a different angle." She looked at Cutter. He needed Silas financially compromised enough that a default became realistic. He needed the finances misrepresented in the contract to ensure I'd arrive with fewer protections than I thought I had. He needed the clause in the original contract to make sure that even my contributions to the ranch could be counted against us in a default. Cutter absorbed this. "He needed you here. He needed someone here who'd work to improve the ranch," she said, "because an improved ranch with a debt default is worth more than a collapsed one. He wanted the improvement without having to pay for it." Cutter looked at her with the gray, sharp eyes that had been measuring her since the first morning. "That's cold," he said. "That's what planning looks like when someone has enough time and money to be patient," she said. He finished his coffee and set the mug down. He stood. "I'll have the herd ready by 6, he said. "The 3 that are stressed, I'll keep them together, make sure they're not pushed too hard on the road." "Thank you, Dob." He stopped at the kitchen doorway. She'd used his first name without planning to, and they both noticed it. He didn't comment. He just stood for a moment with one hand on the doorframe. "That heifer," he said. "Margaret." "She's better," Elena said. "She'll hold up tomorrow." "Good," he said, and went. Elena sat alone in the kitchen for another hour. She thought about what she was going to have to do tomorrow, standing in front of a crowd of strangers, making accusations about a man who owned a third of the valley, with nothing on her side but documentation and the truth, and a few people who'd decided to trust her. She was not afraid of public speaking. She'd done it before, in smaller venues for smaller stakes. But she was afraid of something else, the particular fear that comes when you've committed yourself entirely to a course of action and you're close enough to the moment that you can see exactly how much depends on it going right. She thought about Voss reading that baggage tag and saying worthless cargo to a crowd that laughed. She thought about sitting on the bed in the room at the east end of the house on her first night, listening to the ranch breathe, deciding to be careful. She thought about Poke with a split palm keeping his hand wrapped and working, about Cutter walking the new pasture layout for half a day before admitting it might work, about Tom Hennessy making a copy of a document before sending the original back. She thought about Margaret standing at the far end of the near pasture, head down, 3 weeks ago. And Margaret this morning, eating, head up, moving with the deliberate energy of an animal that had been genuinely sick and had come through it. She closed her notebook. She went upstairs to her room. She lay down with her boots off but her clothes on, which was how she'd been sleeping for the last week, because something in her body understood before her brain did that they were close to something. She slept 3 hours, which was enough. At 4:30, she heard Silas moving downstairs. At 5, she heard the barn door. At 5:15, the first cattle sounds from the yard as Cutter and Poke began the careful work of moving 15 animals through a gate and onto a road. She got up, put her boots on, and went downstairs. The kitchen was lit by one lamp, and it smelled of coffee that Silas had already made. And through the window above the sink, she could see the yard in the early dark, the lanterns of the hands moving through it like slow fireflies, the large, quiet shapes of cattle beginning to move. She poured coffee. She stood at the window and watched. Silas came through the back door at 5:30 and stopped when he saw her at the window. "They're moving well," he said. "I can see." He poured coffee. He stood beside her at the window. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which was different from the warmth of the lamp, and neither of them moved away from it. "I thought about what you said," he said, "about the auction, standing up in front of everyone." "And?" He looked out the window. "I thought about every time in the last 4 months I could have done something similar, could have been louder, could have pushed back harder in public instead of trying to handle things quietly." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Quiet hasn't worked." "No," she said. "So we stopped being quiet." She looked at him. His face in the lamplight was tired and set, and somewhere beneath the tiredness was something that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago when a stagecoach had pulled into Dry Creek, and she'd stood in the mud assessing a town that had already decided what she was. She couldn't name it exactly. She just knew it was different. "When we get there," she said, "whatever happens, stay close to the cattle. Let me do the talking initially. You'll know when to come in." "How will I know?" "Because I'll look at you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You've thought this through." "I've thought about nothing else for 2 days." He nodded slowly. "All right." He drank his coffee, looked back out the window at the moving cattle, the lanterns, the yard going from full dark to the first pre-dawn gray. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "That first night," he said. "You sat at that table for 2 hours going through ledgers you had no obligation to touch. 3 days into being here, after everything that had already happened that day." He shook his head, not dismissing the memory, but sitting with it. "I didn't know what to do with that." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you figure it out?" He looked at her, something in his eyes that was steadier than anything else in the room. "Getting there," he said. Outside, Cutter's voice carried across the yard, low, practical, directing, and the cattle moved, and the first light was beginning to do something real at the ridgeline, and in 9 miles Dry Creek was waking up, and in the largest auction ground in the valley, buyers and ranchers and business people were already arriving for the biggest cattle auction of the season. Harlan Voss, Elena knew, would already be there. He would be working the crowd the way he always did, the handshakes, the quiet words, the particular art of making people feel like he was doing them a favor by talking to them. He would have told his version of Iron Ridge Ranch's problems to every buyer willing to listen. He would have his men positioned. He would have Garrett Souls somewhere nearby with whatever paper he needed. He would believe the night's work had finished it. The fences, the scattered cattle, the stress and the lost sleep, and the 9 miles of road still to travel. He would not be expecting what was coming. She drank her coffee. She put the mug in the basin. She picked up her saddlebag with the notebook and the documents inside. She went out into the yard where the cattle were moving, and the sky was going from gray to the particular pale gold that came just before the sun cleared the ridge, and she found none already saddled at the fence post, Cutter having done it without being asked, which was the kind of man he was when you'd given him a reason to be. She swung up into the saddle. Silas was mounted beside her, and behind them the 5 hands, Cutter, Poke, and 3 others, had the 15 head moving in a steady line out of the yard and onto the road to Dry Creek. Margaret was in the middle of the group, moving steadily, head up. Elena looked at her for a moment, thought about the first morning, the heifer standing apart at the far end of the pasture, head low, the quiet patience of an animal waiting to see if things would get better or worse. They'd gotten better. She turned none toward the road and rode. The auction grounds at Dry Creek were the largest open space in the valley that wasn't someone's pasture, a flat expanse of packed earth behind the feed warehouse that expanded once a season into something resembling a town square with ambitions. By 8 in the morning, it was already crowded in the particular way that auction days always produced. Ranchers in work clothes standing in clusters, buyers in slightly better work clothes standing in different clusters, and the two groups occasionally intersecting with the careful social choreography of people who needed each other but didn't always want to admit it. There were probably 200 people when Elena rode in with the herd behind her. By 9:30 there would be more. She saw Voss immediately. He was near the auctioneer's platform, talking to two men she didn't recognize, buyers, from the look of them, out-of-valley money, the kind that came to regional auctions looking for undervalued stock. He was doing what she'd expected, working the room before the room knew it needed working. His three men were positioned at different points around the grounds. She clocked all of them in the first 2 minutes without appearing to look. Garrett Soules was near the registration table with a leather satchel that he held with the self-conscious grip of a man who needed people to know he was carrying important documents. Elena swung down from none and handed the reins to Poke. "Keep her close," she said, "and stay with the cattle. Don't let anyone cut in between them and the pen." "Anyone meaning Voss's men?" Poke said. "Anyone," she said. She walked to the registration table and signed in the Iron Ridge cattle. The woman behind the table, 50-ish, wire-rimmed glasses, the efficient expression of someone who'd run auction registration for more years than she found interesting, looked at the Iron Ridge name and then at Elena with a brief evaluating look. 15 head, Elena said. "Pen assignment?" "Pen 7, the woman said. And then, quietly without looking up from her ledger, "Tom Hennessy's been here since 7. Asked where you'd be." She glanced up. "Thought you'd want to know." Elena looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," the woman said. "Just sign the line." She signed the line. Tom Hennessy found her at pen 7 while Cutter and the hands were settling the cattle. He had Carl with him, and a third man Elena didn't know, younger, maybe 35, with the careful eyes of someone who spent his time looking at animals professionally. "This is Dr. Ames," Tom said. "Veterinary man. Practices out of Callahan." Elena looked at the third man. "You came a long way for an auction." "Tom asked me to," Ames said simply. He looked at the cattle in the pen. "These the ones?" "These are the ones," she said. He went to the pen fence and looked. He didn't hurry. He moved his eyes across each animal with the systematic attention of someone who'd done this long enough that his eyes knew what to look for before his brain had to ask. "Which one had the nutritional deficiency?" "White patch on the left flank," Elena said. "Second from the back." He found Margaret. He looked at her for a long moment. "She's thin," he said. "She was thinner," Elena said. 6 weeks ago, she was standing with her head down at the far end of the pasture, not eating. We've had her on supplemental feeding and the treatment you recommended by letter." Ames looked at her then. "You're the one who wrote the letter." "Yes." He looked back at Margaret. "She's better," he said. "Not where she should be, but better." He turned to face Elena. "What you described in that letter was accurate. The treatment was right. Most people would have just watched that animal decline." "I didn't have that option," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You want me to examine them all before the bidding?" "I want you to be available," she said, "in case anyone has questions." He understood what she meant. He nodded and stepped back from the fence. Tom Hennessy was watching Voss across the grounds. "He's been telling people the herd is diseased," he said quietly. "Said there's a cover-up. Respiratory fever still in the herd." "I know. There are 3 buyers here who've already told me they're not bidding on Iron Ridge stock because of what Voss said." "I know that too," Elena said. She looked at the herd in the pen, 15 animals that she'd spent 6 weeks studying, treating, feeding, worrying over. They were not perfect. The stress of last night's fence sabotage and this morning's road was in their posture, a slight tightness in how they held themselves. But they were real, and they were alive, and they were not diseased. "How are you going to fix it?" Tom asked. "By saying it out loud," Elena said, "in front of everyone." Carl Hennessy, who had not spoken yet, said, "That's going to make Voss angry." "He's already angry," she said. "He's just hiding it better today because he thinks he's already won." She left them at the pen and found Silas near the platform where the auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who'd been running Dry Creek auctions for 15 years, was organizing his papers. Silas was watching the grounds with the still-eyed attention he used when he was tracking multiple things simultaneously. Voss spoke to Pruitt, Silas said without preamble. What did he say? I don't know exactly, but Pruitt came over to me 20 minutes ago and told me the Iron Ridge lot may be moved to the end of the day's bidding. Administrative reasons. His voice was flat. There are no administrative reasons. Elena looked at the platform, then at Pruitt, then at the crowd, which was growing. She did a rough count and revised upward, closer to 250 now, more arriving from the road. If we go last, she said, the serious buyers will have spent their budgets. Voss gets the herd sold cheap if it sells at all, and the weak sale price becomes the story he uses to justify moving on the debt. Yes, Silas said. She looked at him. I need 5 minutes with Pruitt before the auction starts. He's not going to want to hear it. He doesn't have to want to, she said. He just has to listen. She walked to the platform. Pruitt looked up when she approached with the defensive expression of a man who'd already been visited by too many people with requests this morning. Miss Hawthorne, she said, Iron Ridge Ranch. She put her hand on the edge of his registration table. I understand the Iron Ridge lot has been moved to end of day. Administrative, Mr. Pruitt, she said. Her voice was even, and she kept it quiet enough that only he could hear. I know what Harlan Voss asked you to do, and I know what he offered you to do it. I'm not going to make accusations publicly about that because I think you're a man who's been put in a bad position, not a bad man. She held his eyes. But I need to tell you something about the Iron Ridge cattle and about what's been done to that ranch in the past 4 months, and you need to hear it before this auction starts. Not because I'm asking a favor, because you run this auction, and when the truth comes out today, and it will, you'll want to be on the right side of it. Pruitt looked at her. He was the kind of man whose face communicated more than he intended. She could see him calculating, the discomfort of a person caught between two forces and trying to determine which one was more dangerous. You've got 2 minutes, he said. She talked for 4. He didn't stop her at 2. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the grounds. He looked at the pen where the Iron Ridge cattle stood. He looked across the grounds to where Voss was still working the buyer clusters, still performing the relaxed confidence of a man who was running a script he'd rehearsed. Iron Ridge lot goes in position 4, Pruitt said. His voice had the quality of a man making a decision before he could think himself out of it. Same as originally scheduled. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said, which was the second time this morning someone had said that to her. Just be ready when Pruitt calls the lot. She was ready. The auction opened at 9 o'clock with the standard lots. Smaller numbers, single animals, the kind of transactions that warmed a crowd up. Elena stood near pen 7 and watched and listened and let the rhythm of the morning settle into her. Beside her, Cutter had positioned himself at the pen gate with his arms crossed and the expression of a man prepared to stand there indefinitely. Poke was at the far corner. The other hands were distributed around the pen's perimeter without anyone having told them to be. They'd figured it out themselves, which told Elena something about what the last 6 weeks had built. Silas stood to her left, close enough to speak to quietly. He'd been watching Voss with the contained expression he used for things that made him angry. His 3 men, he said quietly. 2 moved to the left side of the crowd when Pruitt changed the lot order back. 1 went somewhere I can't see. Looking for souls, Elena said. Why? Because whatever Voss is planning for when our lot comes up, souls is the paper part of it. She scanned the grounds. She found souls near the east edge of the crowd, still with the satchel, now also with one of Voss's men standing close to him, having a conversation with someone she couldn't identify from this distance. Tom Hennessy appeared at her elbow. Lot 4, he said, 2 minutes. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. She thought about what she'd said in the kitchen that morning. You'll know when to come in, because I'll look at you. And she thought he remembered it too, from the quality of attention in his expression. All right, she said. Pruitt's voice carried across the grounds with the practiced projection of a man who'd been doing this for 15 years. Lot 4, Iron Ridge Ranch, 15 head of mixed. Hold on, Pruitt. The voice came from across the grounds, and it was not loud, but it carried with the particular authority of a man who'd spent 20 years making rooms pay attention to him. Harlan Voss moved through the crowd the way he always moved, the water and the current, And people stepped aside not because they were afraid, but because the habit of stepping aside for Harlan Voss was deeply established in Dry Creek. He stopped near the platform. He looked at Pruitt, and then at the crowd, and then at Elena with the smooth, composed expression of a man performing patience. "I have a concern about this lot," he said, for the benefit of the buyers present. He opened his hands, the gesture of a reasonable man sharing information. "There have been reports of continued disease in the Iron Ridge herd. I'd hate for anyone here to take on stock that compromises their healthy animals." The crowd murmured. Elena felt it, the social weight of Voss's authority pressing on the room. Two of the buyers she'd seen earlier stepped back slightly from the pen fence. She stepped forward. "Mr. Voss," she said, clearly, carrying, "you're describing a disease outbreak that doesn't exist." Voss turned to look at her with the expression he'd used on the main street 6 weeks ago, the theatrical patience of a man tolerating something beneath him. "Miss Hawthorne, this is a business discussion." "Then let's have a business discussion," she said. She reached into her saddlebag and produced the notebook, not waving it, not performing with it, just holding it where it was visible. "There is a veterinary man present, Dr. Ames, out of Callahan, who has examined this herd this morning. Dr. Ames, what did you find?" Ames's voice from near the pen fence was calm and professional. 15 animals. No sign of respiratory disease. One animal recovering from a nutritional deficiency, underweight but not contagious, not declining, responding well to treatment. The remainder are sound. "The remainder are sound," Elena repeated for the crowd. She looked at Voss. "What disease were you referring to?" Voss's expression didn't crack. He was too experienced for that, but something behind it recalibrated. "There were reports in March, Elena said. 4 months ago, before the affected animals were removed from the herd, before the surviving animals were assessed and treated, before," she paused, "before a great deal of things that I've documented in detail." She opened the notebook. "I've been at Iron Ridge Ranch for 6 weeks. In that time, I documented 3 separate incidents of fence sabotage. I have the dates, the locations, descriptions of how the damage was done, fence posts cut below ground level to mimic rot, and the sections of fence line targeted, which in each case corresponded to areas where cattle would be most likely to scatter into dangerous terrain." The crowd was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that happens when people are paying close attention and don't want to interrupt. "I also have documentation of a legal document produced by Garrett Souls." She looked across the crowd and found Souls, who had gone very still near the east edge, presented to a supply wagon on the county road as a right-of-way claim. A document that Carl Hennessy, a former land clerk of 8 years' experience, identified as constructed to appear legitimate without actually being so. She held up the folded copy Carl had made. "I have a copy." Voss took one step forward. His voice was still controlled. "These are serious accusations. They are," she said, "and I have 6 weeks of documentation behind every one of them. But I want to tell this crowd something more important than the sabotage and the false documents." She looked around, not performing, just making sure she was speaking to the room, not at it. "When I arrived in Dry Creek 6 weeks ago, Mr. Voss stood on the main street and announced to a crowd that I was worthless cargo." She let that sit for a moment. "He did that because he needed this town to see me as nothing, because a woman this town had dismissed would be easier to use and easier to discard." She looked at Voss directly. He'd arranged the marriage contract that brought me here through his own accountant. He'd ensured the financial misrepresentation in the documents. He'd included a clause in the original contract, a clause not shared with me, that would have made my contributions to Iron Ridge part of the estate in a default. He needed someone to improve that ranch for him. He needed the improvement to happen before the default he was engineering. The murmur in the crowd was different now. Not uncertain, not waiting. The specific murmur of people who are processing information and arriving at conclusions. Souls moved. He took 2 steps toward the road and stopped because Tom Hennessy had stepped into his path, not aggressively, just solidly. A large man occupying space in a way that communicated that moving through it was going to be a decision. "The cattle in Pen 7, Elena said, and her voice was still even because she was nearly done and she was not going to let the last 100 yards cost her what the first 9 miles had built. are sound animals from a ranch that has been systematically targeted for destruction by a man who wanted the land without paying fair price for it. I am asking every buyer here to look at these cattle with your own eyes, not with Harlan Voss's eyes, yours. She stopped talking. The silence that followed was 10 seconds, maybe 15, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for the crowd to feel it. Tom Hennessy spoke from near the pen fence. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. I'll bid on Iron Ridge stock. Carl Hennessy beside him. Same. A man Elena didn't know from the back of the crowd. Older, heavy-set, with the weathered look of someone who'd been ranching for 30 years. What's the opening? Pruitt on the platform had the expression of a man who'd made the right decision this morning and was now watching it bear out in real time. He looked at his papers. He looked at the crowd. He called the opening bid. What happened next was not clean. It was not the simple sweep of justice that stories like to supply at their climaxes. 3 of the buyers Voss had worked stayed where they were and didn't bid. One of them looked at his boots. 2 of Voss's men moved through the crowd trying to talk to people. Elena could see them doing it, the urgent, quiet conversations. And a few people shifted, uncertain. But the bidding started. It started with Tom Hennessy and went to the man from the back of the crowd, and then to a buyer Elena had never seen, a woman in a practical coat who'd arrived on horseback and had been standing near the pen fence since before the lot was called, and had apparently been looking at those 15 animals for a long time before deciding what she thought of them. Voss stood near the platform with his arms at his sides. He was watching the bidding with the expression of a man watching something he'd built get taken apart, and he was handling it with the composure of someone who'd had enough practice with setbacks to know how to stand through them without showing what they cost. He caught Elena's eye once. Just once, across the grounds, the crowd between them. She held his gaze and didn't look away first, and after a moment he turned and walked toward the road, his 2 men falling in behind him, and that was the last time she saw Harlan Voss that day. Soleil's did not follow. Souls was still near the east edge, Tom Hennessy still occupying the space around him, and 2 other men had joined Tom, ranchers from the look of them, people who'd heard what Elena said and had drawn their own conclusions, and apparently decided that Garrett Souls's afternoon movement options should be somewhat limited until certain things were clarified. The bidding went 4 rounds. When Pruitt called it done, Elena did the math in her head. The number, the debt calculation she'd been carrying for 6 weeks, the figures Silas had told her at the table on her 4th night at Iron Ridge. She turned to find Silas standing directly behind her. She hadn't heard him move closer during the bidding. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual because she'd gotten reasonably good at reading him. It's enough, she said. He blinked. What? The final bid. It covers both outstanding payments. She did the number again in her head to be sure. With enough left for winter operating costs. He looked at the platform, at Pruitt, writing the numbers. Back at her. He said nothing for a moment. The crowd around them was moving again, the post-bidding circulation of an auction returning to its normal energy. Somewhere behind them, Cutter was arranging the transfer of the cattle with the buyer's hands. Polk said something to the woman in the practical coat, and she laughed, which was not something Elena had expected. You're sure? Silas said. I'm sure, she said. He exhaled. It was not a dramatic breath, no collapse, no visible relief releasing all at once. It was quieter than that, more like a man who'd been holding something at a specific angle for a very long time and had just been told he could put it down. The documentation, he said. Souls, what happens? There are enough people here who heard it and have their own histories with what Voss has done in this valley, she said. Tom Hennessy's not the only one. What happens to Souls legally is not something I can control, but what happens to his ability to operate in this valley? She looked toward the east edge where Souls was still being very carefully stood next to. That's already happening. Cutter appeared at Silas's shoulder. Cattle transferred, he said. Buyer satisfied. He looked at Elena. Dr. Ames wants to talk to you about a follow-up visit for the herd. Says he'd like to see the nutritional recovery progress in a month. Tell him yes, she said, and tell him I'll write him a full update before then. Cutter nodded. He started to turn and stopped. He looked at the grounds, at the dispersing crowd, at the empty pen 7. Then he looked at Elena and Silas with the gray, sharp eyes that had been measuring things since before Elena arrived, and would keep measuring them long after. "Not bad," he said, and turned and walked toward the pen. Poke materialized with Nun's reins and his own horse, and the expression of a young man who'd been present for something significant and hadn't yet decided how to carry it. "Are we going home?" he asked. Elena looked at him, thought about what home had meant 6 weeks ago when she'd arrived with a trunk and a contract and a town that had already written her off. Thought about what it meant now. "Yes," she said, "we're going home." The road back to Iron Ridge was 9 miles of the same terrain it had always been. The first 4 miles manageable, the ridge crossing difficult. The descent into the valley the part that required attention. Nun picked her footing with the same steady intelligence she always did. The cattle were gone, transferred to the buyer's people, and without them the return journey was faster and quieter. They rode mostly without talking. The afternoon had the particular exhausted quality of days that had contained too much, and the silence between the riders was not awkward but necessary. The kind of quiet that comes after something has been resolved and the body needs time to believe it. At the top of the ridge, where the road crested and the valley opened below, Silas pulled up beside her. The ranch sat against the far ridge in the afternoon light, the barn and the house, and the fences and the pastures where the cattle that remained would be grazing in the slow, patient way of animals, with enough to eat. "I've been thinking," Silas said. "About what?" He looked at the ranch below. The contract, the original terms. He was choosing words with care, which was his way when something mattered. Whatever legal weight it had, or didn't have, it was built on bad information, on what souls put together. He paused. "I don't want whatever we build from here to have that as its foundation." She looked at him. "What are you proposing?" He met her eyes. "I'm proposing we start over. Different terms. Terms that are honest about what this is and what we've both put into it." He held her gaze. "Equal partnership. On the ranch. On the decisions. On whatever comes after." She looked at him for a long moment. At the angular face with the jaw that didn't set quite right from an old break. At the eyes that went still when he was thinking. At the man who had told her the truth when the truth was inconvenient, who had stood behind her when she spoke in front of 200 people and had not needed to be told what his role was. "Equal partnership," she said. "Yes." "You understand that means when I think you're wrong about something, I'll say so." "You've been doing that since day 4, he said. "I'm used to it." She looked back at the valley. At Iron Ridge, sitting in the afternoon light with its fences and its tired pastures that were slowly coming back, and its barn and its house with the east-facing room where she'd lain awake her first night listening to the ranch breathe. "All right," she said, "equal partnership." He nodded. Neither of them moved immediately. They sat on horseback at the top of the ridge and looked at what they'd kept, and the afternoon light moved across the valley the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful. And below them, Iron Ridge Ranch sat where it had always sat, waiting for them to come back to it. They rode down. The first snow came early that year. It arrived on a Thursday in late October, which was 3 weeks ahead of what the almanac predicted, and 2 weeks ahead of what Cutter's knees predicted, and his knees had a better track record than the almanac. It came overnight, quietly, the way the valley's weather often did. You went to sleep under a cold, clear sky and woke up to a world that had been rearranged while you weren't watching. By the time Elena was up at 5:30, the near pasture had 2 inches on it, and the cattle were moving through it with the slow, offended energy of animals that had been caught unprepared. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched them and thought, this is the 3rd month. 3 months since the auction. 3 months since she'd stood in front of 200 people and said out loud what she'd spent 6 weeks documenting in a notebook that someone had rifled through in the night, hoping to understand how much she knew. 3 months since Silas had pulled up beside her on the Ridge Road and proposed equal partnership in language that was practical and real, and nothing like what a contract said. A lot had happened in 3 months. Garrett Soules had left Dry Creek 17 days after the auction, which was not quite the legal reckoning Elena had hoped for, but was more than nothing. What had happened was quieter and in some ways more permanent than a courtroom. Tom Hennessy had spoken to the county land clerk, Carl had provided his documentation of the false right-of-way claim, and 3 other ranchers in the valley had come forward with their own experiences of documents that Soules had prepared that didn't quite hold up to examination. No single thing was enough on its own. Together, They were enough to make Dry Creek a town that Garrett Souls couldn't operate in anymore. He'd packed up his office on a Tuesday and been gone by Wednesday evening, and nobody had said much about it publicly, which was its own kind of verdict. Harlan Voss was a more complicated story, because Harlan Voss had money and patience and lawyers, and those three things together were a specific kind of durable. He hadn't left Dry Creek. He still owned his third of the valley. He still walked through town with the bearing of a man accustomed to being the largest force in any room, but something had shifted in the room's response to him, a subtle recalibration, the kind you felt more than saw. People still stepped aside when he moved through a crowd. They just didn't lean toward him the way they used to. Elena had learned in the weeks since the auction that what she had done on that auction ground had mattered not because it defeated Voss in any clean or permanent sense, but because it had changed the cost of siding with him. People who'd been sitting on fences, and there were always people sitting on fences, that was just the reality of living in a valley where one man held most of the economic leverage, had seen that there was another side to sit on. That had value. It didn't eliminate Voss's power overnight, but it began the slow erosion of it. Two of the ranchers who'd heard Elena speak at the auction had since come to her privately, separately, on different weeks, with the careful casualness of people who didn't want it to look like what it was. They'd shared their own histories with Voss, supply pressures, debt arrangements that hadn't been what they'd seemed when signed, boundary disputes settled in Voss's favor through the kind of legal maneuvering that was technically legitimate and practically coercive. Elena had listened, and she'd asked careful questions, and she'd sent both men to a lawyer in Millvane, not the one Voss used, a different one, a woman named Clara Briggs, who had a reputation for being difficult in the specific way that was useful when someone powerful was the opposing party. She didn't know yet what would come of that. She suspected it would take time. Some things did. What she knew was that Iron Ridge Ranch had made its debt payments, both of them, on time for the first time in 2 years. She knew because she'd been there when Silas came back from the bank in town, and she'd watched his face when he walked through the door. And what was on his face was not celebration. He wasn't built for celebration, not the obvious kind, but something quieter and more real. The particular expression of a man who'd been carrying a specific weight for a specific amount of time and had just been allowed to set it down. She'd been at the table with the ledgers when he came in, which was where she was most mornings. He'd stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and said, "Paid." She'd looked up. "Both payments?" "Both." He paused. "With $43 remaining." She'd looked at him for a moment, then she'd gone back to the ledgers. "Good," she said. "We'll need those $43 for the feed order." He'd made a sound, the laugh that started in him and didn't always make it fully to the surface. "Of course we will," he said. The snow was still coming down when Cutter knocked on the kitchen door at 6 o'clock. He never used the front door. She didn't know if he'd ever used the front door in 12 years. "Cattle are restless," he said. "That northeast section of fence is going to need checking. The posts we replaced after the sabotage, the ground's shifted with the freeze." "I'll come out," she said. "You don't need to—" "I'll come out," she said again, already putting her coat on. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her. "You know," he said, "most people who came to a ranch like this under circumstances like yours would have been gone by the second week." She looked at him. "You said something similar to Poke after I moved the trough." He told me. Cutter absorbed this with the expression of a man making a note to have a conversation with Poke about what constituted private commentary. "I'm saying it to you directly now." "Why now?" He looked at the snow coming down in the yard, at the cattle moving in the near pasture, at the barn where Luther's dark head was visible over the half-door, watching the weather with equine skepticism. "Because you stayed," he said, "and because of why you stayed." He shrugged, which was as close as Cutter got to elaborating on something emotional. Seemed worth saying. She looked at him. Dob Cutter, who'd been with this land for 12 years and had watched it struggle and had stayed anyway, who'd stood in the pen at the auction making sure nobody cut in between the cattle and the gate, who told her the trough move might work and then acted like it had been his idea. "Thank you, Dob," she said. He turned and went out into the snow before she could see whatever his face was doing. She followed him into the yard. The fence posts held. The northeast section had shifted with the freeze, but not badly. 2 posts needed resetting, an hour's work, and by 8 o'clock it was done. Poke had worked beside her the whole time, talking occasionally in the way he did, jumping between topics with the energy of a young man whose mind moved faster than his mouth could usually manage. At one point, resetting the second post, he said, "Do you think Voss will try again?" Elena tamped the ground around the post base. "Probably," she said, "but differently." "But differently," she confirmed. "Men like Voss don't stop. They adjust." Poke thought about this. "So we have to keep adjusting too." "That's the job," she said. "It's always been the job. We just know it more clearly now." He was quiet for a moment, working. Then, "I almost left. After Tomas did. I had an offer from a ranch in Callahan, not Voss's, just a regular offer, better wages." He didn't look at her while he said it. "I stayed because of what Silas said at that morning meeting, when he told us the truth." She looked at him. He was still not quite looking at her, focused on the post. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "Me too," he said. "Turns out it matters. Who you stay with." They finished the fence and walked back to the barn, and Elena thought about what Poke had said with the simple directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to dress things up. It matters, who you stay with, and thought that it was true in more ways than a 20-year-old ranch hand had probably intended. The legal matter with the contract's hidden clause was resolved, eventually, in the way that messy legal things resolved themselves when they didn't have a clear villain standing in a courtroom. Clara Briggs and Milvain wrote 3 letters over 6 weeks and received responses that were evasive and then defensive, and then, on the 3rd letter, quietly conciliatory. The clause was formally voided. The agency in Millbrook, which had been Solz's creation rather than any legitimate institution, Elena had suspected this, and Briggs had confirmed it, dissolved itself with the particular suddenness of things that were never supposed to be examined closely. Silas had been the one to tell her when the final letter came. He'd found her in the far pasture where she was checking the 3rd rotation section, the one that had been bare earth when she arrived and was now, slowly, imperfectly, with patches that still needed attention, covered in real grass. He'd handed her the letter without saying anything. She'd read it. She'd stood in the pasture in the November cold and read a legal letter that said, in the formal language that lawyers use to describe simple things, that nothing Harlan Voss had engineered around her arrival had any binding power over her. She'd already known that in the ways that mattered. But there was something about seeing it in formal language, something about the acknowledgement that what had been done to her had been real and that it hadn't worked, that sat differently than she'd expected. She'd folded the letter and given it back to him. "Keep it," he said. "I don't need it," she said. "Keep it anyway," he said. "Some things should be documented." She looked at him. He was using her own logic back at her, and he knew it, and the slight quality in his expression acknowledged that he knew it. She took the letter back and put it in her coat pocket. "The pasture looks better," he said, looking at the section around them. "It's getting there," she said. "It'll need another full season before I'd call it recovered." "But it's getting there." "Yes." He looked out across the pasture. The grass was thin in places, but real, and the ground beneath it was less compacted than it had been, and in the spring, she'd been thinking about this since October, they could seed the bare patches, and by summer the rotation would be running the way it was supposed to. "I've been thinking about the spring," he said. "So have I," she said. "The Delwood parcel came up for sale last week," he said. 60 acres on the South Ridge. Good grazing, creek access. If we could expand— "How much?" she asked. He told her. She did the math in her head with the quick facility that had become second nature after months of running Iron Ridge's numbers daily. "We could make an offer in February," she said, "if the winter costs stay where they're projected." "I think they will." "So do I." She paused. "But we should look at it first. I want to see the condition of the grazing before we commit." "Obviously," he said. She looked at him. "I wasn't sure it was obvious to you. You grew up here. Sometimes people buy land based on memory." "I grew up here," he said. "I also watched my father buy land based on memory once." He met her eyes. "We'll look at it first." She nodded. They stood in the 3rd rotation pasture in the November cold, and Elena looked at the grass coming in on ground that had been damaged and was healing, and thought about the 60 acres on the South Ridge, and the spring seeding and the debt payments made on time, and the $43 that had become the feed order and was now gone and would be replaced by the next thing they earned and spent, and that was how a ranch actually worked. Not in dramatic salvations, but in the continuous, grinding, occasionally satisfying work of keeping something alive that wanted to keep living. The thing she hadn't expected when she'd stepped off a stagecoach in Dry Creek with a contract and a trunk was how much she would come to love the work itself. Not love in the easy sense, in the sense of recognition, the feeling of doing something that used every part of her and asked for more, the feeling of problems that were real and solutions that were never quite clean but were hers to find. She'd had that feeling in Kansas with her uncle, and she'd lost it in the rooming house in Millbrook, writing figures into other people's ledgers. And she'd found it again in a valley she hadn't chosen under circumstances that had been engineered to defeat her. Which meant the people who'd engineered those circumstances had, despite everything, accidentally given her the thing she'd been looking for. She wasn't grateful to them for that. But she noticed the irony of it. That evening, after supper, Silas brought something down from the shelf in the main room and put it on the kitchen table. It was the baggage tag from her trunk, the small card that had made the journey from Millbrook, that Voss had taken in his hand on her first day in Dry Creek and used to perform her humiliation for a crowd. She'd kept it in the trunk itself, tucked into a corner under the extra blanket, and she hadn't mentioned it, and he hadn't mentioned it, and she'd occasionally thought about what to do with it and hadn't decided. She looked at it on the table, then at him. "I found it when you had me move the trunk last month," he said. "I was going to leave it. Then I thought, He stopped. "I thought it should be somewhere you could see it, if you wanted." She picked it up. Small, worn at the edges, the printing slightly smeared from the journey. Elena Hawthorne, Millbrook to Dry Creek, Iron Ridge Ranch. Nothing else. Just a travel tag doing exactly what a travel tag was supposed to do. "He made up the rest," she said. "I know," Silas said. "You told me that on the first night." She turned it over in her hands. She thought about standing on that main street with the whole town watching, feeling the words land, choosing to stand where she was rather than fold. She thought about what it had cost and what it had built, and how those two things were sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the same. She set the tag on the shelf above the fireplace, where you could see it from the kitchen table when you were working, which was most of the time. "There," she said. Silas looked at it on the shelf. "There," he agreed. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him, the way they'd sat on her fourth night when he'd brought out the ledgers, and she'd spent 2 hours with them and decided to stay. The lamp between them. The fire going. Outside, the snow had stopped and the valley was very still. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "The contract, the original one, it's void now, legally, formally." He was looking at the table, not at her. "Which means you could go. If you wanted. There's nothing holding you." He paused. "I want to make sure you know that." She looked at him for a long moment. He was doing the thing he'd done on her first morning, telling her what her options were before she asked, making sure she knew the exit was real. She'd found it frustrating then, because it had felt like he was looking for an excuse to send her away. She understood it better now. It was how he was built. He needed the people around him to be there because they'd chosen it, not because they were trapped. "I know I could go," she said. "Okay," he said. "I'm not going." He looked up at her. "Because of the ranch." "Because of the ranch," she said. "And because of other things." He held her eyes. Outside somewhere, one of the cattle made a low sound that carried in the winter quiet. Contented, not alarmed, the sound of an animal settled in its pasture. Luther moved in the barn with the slow, patient sound of a horse that had nowhere urgent to be. "The equal partnership," he said. "We agreed on that." "We did. I want to ask you something beyond the equal partnership." She waited. "Not because of the contract or the debt or the ranch or anything we've built here in the last 4 months," he said. "All of that's already decided. That stays regardless." He looked at her steadily. "I want to ask if you want to build the rest of it with me. The years of it, the parts that don't have anything to do with grazing rotation or debt payments." She looked at him. Silas Granger, who had told her the truth when lying would have been easier, who had stood behind her in front of a crowd and not needed to be told what to do, who had named his horse Luther and checked his legs every morning, who said difficult things plainly and never said easy things just to fill silence, who had a jaw that didn't set quite right from an old break, and eyes that went still when he thought, and who had looked at her from the beginning, like someone who was actually seeing her. She thought about what she'd expected when she'd signed a contract in a rooming house in Millbrook. She thought about what she'd gotten instead. "Yes," she said. He nodded, not a small nod, the kind that meant something had settled. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The fire moved. The lamp held steady. On the shelf above the fireplace, the small worn baggage tag sat where she'd put it. Not a wound anymore, or not only a wound, but a reminder of the specific distance between where a person starts and where they end up, if they refuse to let someone else's judgment be the last word on their worth. It was not a perfect life they'd built. It was not going to become one. There were still 60 acres on the South Ridge that needed looking at, and a spring seeding that might not take in the bare patches, and Harlan Voss still owned his third of the valley and would adjust his methods and try something different eventually. And the ranch had a fence line on the northeast corner that the freezing ground was going to keep testing, and Polk was going to do something impulsive at some point, because that was Polk, and Cutter's knees were getting worse, and he'd never admit it, and the almanac was going to be wrong again next year about when the snow came. None of that was going to be easy. None of it was supposed to be. Elena looked across the table at Silas, and he looked back at her, and between them the lamp burned with the ordinary, imperfect, reliable light of something that had been lit and tended and kept going, not because it was easy to keep going, but because it mattered to keep going. In the near pasture, Margaret moved through the snow with her head up. The ranch held, and if you had asked Elena Hawthorne, later, in the years that followed, when Iron Ridge had grown past anyone's early estimates, and the South Ridge parcel had become 2 parcels, and Polk had grown into a foreman nobody would have predicted, and Cutter had finally, grudgingly, admitted his knees needed seeing to. If you had asked her what the lesson was, what the thing was that she'd carry, she would not have given you a speech about courage or perseverance, because she'd never been comfortable with those kinds of words, the ones that polished things into shapes that didn't match the original. She would have said something like, "I got here because someone thought I was nothing. I stayed because the land and the work needed someone who wasn't." And then she probably would have gone back to whatever she was doing, because there was always something that needed doing, and it was hers to do, and that was the thing. Not the victory, not the vindication, but the daily, imperfect, necessary work of it that she had wanted all along.